Sherman knew the Pemmican Recipe was out there, somewhere. He just didn't know it would take a stranger's diary to find it. He grew up on Pine Ridge, one of the poorest places in America. And when he went looking for the recipe his ancestors carried across the Great Plains for 1,000 years, there was no one left to ask. Pine Ridge Reservation covers 3,468 square miles in South Dakota. That is roughly the size of Connecticut, the entire state. But the median household income there, as of 2020, was approximately $27,000, less than half the national median. Sherman was born there in 1974, Oglala Lakota, on that land. The food on Pine Ridge when he was a child was not his people's food. It was commodity cheese, canned meat, government surplus processed, foreign, calorie-dense, and nutritionally hollow. As of 2017, the USDA documented that approximately 85% of Pine Ridge residents lived in food desert conditions. No full-service grocery store within a reasonable distance. A reservation the size of Connecticut, with nowhere to buy fresh food. This was not an accident of geography. It was the direct result of a specific, documented federal policy decision. A decision made to eliminate the food system the Oglala Lakota had maintained for 1,000 years. And the center of that food system was the bison. The center was always the bison. For the Oglala Lakota and neighboring Plains nations, the bison was not simply protein. It was the material form of a relationship, ceremonial, economic, kinship, and ecological, all at once. Pemmican dried bison meat, pulverized and pressed with rendered fat and dried chokecherries, was the concentrated form of that relationship. A pemmican recipe was not a recipe in the way we use that word today. It was a living transmission, grandmother to granddaughter, elder to child, hands shaping what hands before them had shaped. Sherman's grandmother never received that transmission. Her grandmother never received it either. The chain was broken deliberately across approximately 3 generations by a system designed to break it. And by the time Sherman stood in a professional Minneapolis kitchen, surrounded by every culinary resource available, he could not call anyone in his family for the Pemmican Recipe. Not because no one picked up, but because no one had been allowed to know it. The silence on that phone was not absence, it was erasure. This is a documentary about a chef reconstructing a food, but more precisely, it is about what cooking looks like when the kitchen becomes an archaeological site, and what grief looks like when it wears an apron. Sherman started working in restaurant kitchens at 13 years old in the Black Hills region of South Dakota. He learned European culinary technique, French sauces, classical knife work, the grammar of a cuisine that was not his. He was good at it. By 2000, he was working as an executive chef in Minneapolis. He had mastered a language fluently that had nothing to do with where he came from. And somewhere in his 30s, that recognition became impossible to ignore. He described it later as noticing a specific shape of emptiness present in every kitchen he had ever worked in. Decades of training, zero connection to Oglala Lakota food. Not because that food didn't exist, but because the system that should have carried it to him had been methodically dismantled. He began asking questions around 2000. He asked family members, elders, community cooks, anyone who might hold a fragment of what his ancestors had prepared on that land. The answers were consistent in a way that was difficult to absorb. People remembered the food existed, they just didn't know how to make it anymore. That is a very specific kind of cultural loss. You know the shape of something without being able to touch it. You know your grandmother knew, and you know she was never given the chance to tell you. In 2014, Sherman formalized what had been a decade of personal searching. He founded the Sous Chef in Minneapolis, a food business with a specific, almost impossible mission. Reconstruct pre-contact Oglala Lakota and Plains cuisine from whatever fragments remained. Not as a historical exhibit, as actual food that actual people could eat today. The Pemmican Recipe was his first obsession and his hardest problem. Reconstruction requires different methods when living transmission has been interrupted. You cannot taste your way to accuracy. You have never tasted the original. You cannot smell your way home. You have no memory of that smell from childhood. You can only read. And the people who wrote things down were almost never Oglala Lakota. They were botanists, Anthropologists, government surveyors, well-meaning strangers. People who observed a food culture from the outside and wrote what they saw, filtered through their own assumptions, their own vocabulary, their own limitations. Reconstructing a pemmican recipe from ethnobotany field notes is like rebuilding a family's entire oral history from a stranger's diary. The facts may be accurate, but the warmth of transmission, the specific way your grandmother's hands shaped the mixture, is gone. It cannot be recovered from paper. Sherman turned to the ethnobotanical field notes of Melvin Gilmore, a non-native botanist who documented Plains food preparation in 1919. Gilmore's book, Uses of Plants by the Indians of the Missouri River Region, became one of Sherman's primary sources. A 100-year-old field notebook, written by an outsider, that was the closest thing to a recipe he could find. But what Sherman discovered inside those pages, and what it cost him to act on it, that part is rarely told. Gilmore documented, among other things, the Lakota use of chokecherries in pemmican preparation. Chokecherries, Prunus virginiana, small, dark, purple-black berries that grow across the northern plains. Tart, astringent. Their juice stains, like iron. The traditional preparation involved crushing the entire cherry, including the pit. This is where a non-indigenous reader might pause. Cherry pits contain amygdalin, a compound that can convert to cyanide under certain conditions. But traditional preparation, crushing the entire cherry and then drying it, renders that compound largely inert through heat and desiccation. This is not folk belief, it is food science that aligns precisely with traditional practice. The problem was, Sherman had to learn this from ethnobotany literature. Not from his family, not from an elder, from a library. Safety knowledge, recovered from a university archive. Consider the implications of that shift. The specific knowledge of how to safely prepare a food his people had eaten for 1,000 years had to be verified through the writings of a non-native scientist because the living transmission was gone. That is not a culinary inconvenience. That is the texture of what cultural erasure actually feels like. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a chef standing in a library, reading about his own grandmother's kitchen in someone else's handwriting. Sherman has described this period as becoming an archaeologist of his own culture. He did not mean it as a metaphor he was proud of. He meant it as an indictment of the system that made archaeology necessary for a living chef to access his own heritage. The boarding school system, operating across approximately 3 generations, from roughly 1880 to 1980, was sufficient to break the living chain of recipe transmission in Sherman's own family. 1,000 years of pemmican preparation. 3 generations of systematic policy. The recipe is gone from living memory. The fragments exist in strangers' notebooks. And Sherman is standing in a professional kitchen, deciding what to do next. He could stop here, declare the loss irreversible, cook European food, and no one could blame him. Or he could become something there is not really a culinary school category for. A chef who builds recipes the way a forensic scientist builds evidence. From fragments, cross-referenced, tested against what the land itself still holds. He chose the second thing, not out of romance, out of something more like refusal. The work that followed was not spiritual and glowing, it was methodical, slow, and repeatedly humbling. Sherman cross-referenced Gilmore's field notes against USDA ethnobotany records, tribal historical documents, and intertribal consultation with knowledge keepers across multiple Plains nations. Every step of the way, he encountered the same structural wound knowledge that should have been transmitted person to person, now scattered across institutional archives. He sourced dried bison, not beef, not any substitute, because authenticity was not an aesthetic choice. It was the point. Bison and the Oglala Lakota are not interchangeable with cattle and European ranching culture. The food system, the ceremonial relationship, the meaning of pemmican, all of it turns on the specific animal. He sourced chokecherries, the whole cherry, pit included, and dried them on racks. He rendered fat from bison, tallow, a process that fills a kitchen with a smell that is rich and animal and ancient in a way that rendered butter simply is not. And then came the moment he has described in several interviews with a quality of stillness that is hard to explain. The first successful reconstruction. Dried bison, pulverized chokecherries, dark purple-black, rendered fat pressed together into dense cakes. The texture? Waxy, cool, resistant, not crumbling, not soft, holding its shape at room temperature the way food designed for a plains winter should. Sherman has said it was the first time a food he cooked smelled like home, without him ever having eaten it before. That sentence carries an entire history of loss inside 6 words. A man in his 40s, a trained professional chef, smelling a food for the first time, and recognizing it as something his body already knew from a transmission that never happened, as if the knowledge had not been fully erased, just held in abeyance, waiting for someone to find the fragments and reassemble them. The taste, dense, slightly sweet tart from the chokecherry, with a finish that was clean and without the sugar-forward sweetness of anything he had prepared in European culinary training. No wheat flour, no refined sugar, no post-contact ingredient of any kind. Just the land 3 ingredients that the northern plains produced and the Oglala Lakota had transformed into something designed to sustain a person across a 1,000-mile winter journey. This is where the culinary world tends to reach for the word traditional and move on. Sherman refuses to let it be that simple, because traditional implies continuity, and what he was doing was not continuity. It was reconstruction. It was archaeological. It was grief work, done with a mortar and bison fat. And it was also an act of defiance against the assumption that what the boarding school system severed could not be recovered. In 2017, Sherman and co-author Beth Dooley published The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. The book included reconstructed pemmican and pemmican-adjacent recipes built from ethnobotany literature and oral history consultation, not family transmission. The book won the James Beard Award for Best American Cookbook, the culinary establishment's highest recognition given to a chef for cooking food that no living member of his family had been allowed to teach him. Sherman did not describe this as triumph. He described it as a beginning, a validation that the reconstruction was worth continuing. And the question he was already holding by 2017 was larger than any award could answer. He had reconstructed the recipe, or the best approximation of it available. But who was going to receive the transmission he had recovered? If he cooked this food alone in a fine dining restaurant and never passed it on, then the boarding school system had simply delayed the erasure by 1 generation. The next Oglala Lakota cook would face the same library, the same stranger's field notes, the same absence on the phone, unless someone built the infrastructure of transmission that the boarding school system had destroyed. And here is where Sherman's story stops being about one chef and starts being about a question every indigenous cook in North America is asking simultaneously. Because Sherman's reconstruction challenge was not unique to the Oglala Lakota. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, each with distinct food traditions, each with their own pemmican, their own specific, irreplaceable, land-based food knowledge. And the boarding school system that broke Sherman's family's chain of transmission was not selective. It reached across the continent. Crystal Wapapa, Kickapoo Nation, opened Wapapa's Kitchen in Oakland, California in 2022. She has publicly described the same experience as Sherman rebuilding traditional foods from ethnobotany records and intertribal consultation, not family recipe inheritance. She cites the same structural cause, boarding school erasure. Different nation, different coast, different food traditions, same wound. Brian Yazzie, Dene Navajo working in Minneapolis, has collaborated on reconstructing desert Southwest food preservation techniques. He has documented the same reconstruction challenge in his own nation's culinary heritage. Plains, California, Southwest. The pattern is not coincidence. It is the documented result of a policy applied nationally, with national consequences. 574 separate stories of lost culinary transmission. 574 separate strangers' field notes to cross-reference. 574 separate moments of a chef standing in a library reading about their grandmother's kitchen. Sherman's answer to this scale of loss was not to cook alone and wait for recognition. His answer was infrastructure. In 2021, he co-founded the Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis, a professional training kitchen with a specific purpose: to train indigenous cooks and food entrepreneurs in reconstructed traditional techniques, including pemmican preparation, and passed the knowledge forward. Not as museum piece, as professional culinary curriculum. The Indigenous Food Lab was designed to be exactly what the boarding school system was designed not to be. A place where indigenous food knowledge moved from one indigenous person to another, with indigenous hands doing the teaching. The specific chain of transmission that was broken being rebuilt, one training kitchen at a time. Also, in 2021, June 17th, specifically, Owamni, by the Sioux Chef, opened in Minneapolis. The name Owamni refers to the swirling waters of a waterfall at what is now Minneapolis, a site the Dakota people considered sacred, a site taken from them under the 1851 Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. Sherman did not choose the riverbank location for its view. He chose it because that land meant something specific, and placing indigenous food on it was not a restaurant decision. It was a legal and historical argument made with a dinner plate. We are still here. These foods sustained us before dietary practices were imposed. On opening night, diners sat on the bank of what the Dakota called the land where the waters reflect the sky. They ate reconstructed plains, food pemmican preparations built from fragments, from library shelves, from the work of a man who learned to cook European food at 13 and spent the next 3 decades finding his way back to his own. There was no wheat on the menu, no dairy, no cane sugar, no ingredient that arrived after European contact. The menu itself was a kind of timeline. Everything on the plate existed in a world before the policies that emptied Pine Ridge of its food. The chokecherry in the pemmican preparation, dark, tart, slightly waxy on the tongue, the taste of the northern plains in August, preserved into something that carries through a Minneapolis winter. Sherman has a word for it. He calls it the taste of a relationship. The bison and the land and the people who understood both present in the food, present at the table, present on the river. In 2022, Owamni won the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant, among the first Indigenous-owned restaurants to receive the award in the Foundation's history. The culinary world registered this as a breakthrough. Sherman registered it as a responsibility, because the question was never whether reconstructed indigenous food deserved fine dining recognition. The question was whether the reconstruction would outlast the man doing it, whether the next generation of Oglala Lakota cooks would inherit a narrative of agency and return, or one of loss. That question is not rhetorical. It is the actual work. Now listen to Sherman, in his own words, from a University of Minnesota Press podcast interview in 2017. He said, "I didn't have grandparents or great-grandparents teaching me how to cook this food. That knowledge was just gone. One word, carrying the weight of approximately 100 years of deliberate erasure." He continued, "So I had to become an archaeologist of my own culture, an archaeologist of his own culture. That is not a title any chef should need. The fact that Sherman needed it, the fact that Wapapaw needed it, that Yazzie needed it, that hundreds of indigenous cooks across this continent need it right now, is the indictment written into every reconstructed pemmican recipe. Not of the chefs, of the policy that made the archaeology necessary. But here is what Sherman insisted on, and what makes his story something other than a tragedy. He refused to let the loss define the ending. The recipe was not transmitted, so he built the infrastructure to transmit it now. The land was taken, so he opened a restaurant on the bank of the sacred river and named it in the Dakota language. The knowledge was scattered in strangers' field notes, so he assembled it, tested it, and then wrote it down in his own name, in his own book, and put it in the hands of indigenous cooks who would come after him. Every act of reconstruction was simultaneously an act of transmission. He became the elder he did not have. In the kitchen, in the library, in the training room of the Indigenous Food Lab, in every batch of pemmican pressed by hands that are not his. The chain did not resume on its own. But the most revealing part of this story is not the reconstruction. It is what the reconstruction reveals about what cooking actually is, when the kitchen is the only place left to make an argument. As of 2024, the Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis continues training Native cooks in reconstructed traditional food techniques. Pemmican preparation, the specific techniques Sherman recovered from Gilmore's 1919 field notes and from USDA ethnobotany records, is now formal culinary curriculum. not memoir, not novelty. Curriculum. Young Oglala Lakota cooks are learning to pulverize dried chokecherries, pit and all, because a man spent a decade in a library, so they would not have to. Food sovereignty legislation is active in multiple state legislatures as of 2024. The argument Sherman made with a dinner plate is now being made in committee rooms. The two arguments are connected, and Sherman has always understood they are the same argument in different rooms. What a nation eats is what a nation is permitted to be. The destruction of the bison-based food system was not incidental to the destruction of Oglala Lakota sovereignty. It was the mechanism. Control what people eat, and you have entered their most intimate relationship with the land they stand on. Restore what people eat, and you have done something that no award and no legislation can fully measure. Sherman was asked once, why the pemmican, specifically, why start there? With the hardest recipe, the one with the most broken chain. He said it was because the pemmican was the bison relationship in edible form. And if you could reconstruct the food, you could begin to reconstruct the relationship. The relationship between the Oglala Lakota and the land that produced the bison, the chokecherry, the rendered fat, a relationship that survived 100 years of commodity cheese. That survived 3 generations of broken transmission. That survived the absence of a grandmother's hands. And arrived dense, dark, slightly sweet tart, waxy and cool and correct, on a plate, on the bank of a sacred river. There's a woman in the Indigenous Food Lab right now. We do not know her name in this story, because her name is not the point. She is holding a mortar. She is crushing dried chokecherries, pit and all, the way the field notes describe. The purple-black dust rising, the iron fruit smell filling the kitchen. She did not learn this from her grandmother. She is learning it now, in a professional training kitchen in Minneapolis, from the curriculum that Sherman built from fragments. And when she is done, when the bison is dried, and the fat is rendered, and the chokecherry is pressed into the mixture, she will know something her grandmother never had the chance to teach her. And she will be able to teach it to the next person who walks into that kitchen. Not the same as what was lost, but a chain, held in living hands, moving forward. Not the same as what was lost, but a chain, held in living hands, moving forward. She is learning it now, in a professional training kitchen in Minneapolis, from the curriculum that Sherman built from fragments. And when she is done, when the bison is dried and the fat is rendered and the chokecherry is pressed into the mixture, she will know something her grandmother never had the chance to teach her. And she will be able to teach it to the next person who walks into that kitchen. The chain, moving again. This is not the same as what was lost,